I'm Nancy Gagne. I'm the Executive Director of the Community Coalition on Race. And our mission is stable racial integration and racial equity in all aspects of community life. And we work on neighborhoods and civic life and social engagement. And one of the biggest areas we work on are the schools, racial equity in the schools, integrated classrooms, and resolving the racial academic achievement gap. And we also do a lot of work with parents on racism and talking to your children about race. And that's why we're here tonight. And with that, I'm going to let us begin.
My name is Meredith Sue Willis, and I am co-chair of the Schools Committee along with Carol Berry Austin, and we're really delighted to have so many people here tonight. This is our first Zoom program. It's not the coalition's first, but it's the Schools Committee's first, so we definitely have kinks, and we hope and I trust it will be satisfactory to everybody. The Schools Committee has been part of the Coalition on Race from the very beginning. The idea of equity and excellence for all children has been with us from the beginning. And one of the things we've been doing recently, Nancy already alluded to, has been giving presentations on how to talk to children about race, how to talk to preschool kids, how to talk to elementary school children, how to talk to everybody. And one of the things that happens is every time we have one of these programs, people ask for more and more. They want more. And so tonight, this is one of our mores. This is our program for the summer. And it's going to be with wonderful Dr. Diane Hughes, whom I'll be introducing in a very short time. But I just wanted to tell you what's happening this evening. So as soon as I finish talking now, Audrey Rowe, the program director, will give you a look at what for those who may not know how best to use the Zoom program. Then I'll do the introduction of Dr. Hughes. And when she has finished her talk and slideshow, there will be question and answer. Now, there are a lot of people here. I have a strong preference for as few emoticons and little dancing martini glasses and things as possible. So I'm going to ask people to actually raise your hand when you want to ask a question. Physically raise your hand near your face. And meanwhile, because everybody will not get called on, you may also use the chat function to ask any question. And all of those questions will be captured after the program. We will be posting them on the website of the coalition along with answers to them. And after the question and answer, there'll be a brief wrap up. And when the time comes, please don't forget the evaluation and letting us know if you want to have more information about the Schools Committee. I'm really excited to get to introduce Diane Hughes, Dr. Diane Hughes. Her professional resume is amazing. She's a professor of applied psychology in the Steinhardt School of Culture, Development, and Education at NYU. And her research focuses on understanding how racial ethnic dynamics influence people's experiences at work, in neighborhoods, and in families. And secondly, she studies the ethnic and cultural differences in parents' socialization goals, beliefs, and practices, especially as these influence children's learning. She's written extensively about how children learn race and how parents and other adults see it. If you haven't looked at it, we have a link to the article that inspired the title of this program, and you really should take a look. It's a very readable and not very long piece. And finally, Diane she has a long-standing relationship with the Community Coalition on Race. She's a former trustee. She's currently active with the Schools Committee, longtime resident of South Orange, where she raised 4 boys in our community. Many of you know that she has also been one of our most popular presenters on talking to children about race. So we're really, really happy that Diane has been willing to come tonight and share her expertise. And Diane, you're really welcome here, and we're delighted to have you, and thank you for coming.
Greetings, everyone. And I wanted to thank the Schools Committee of the Community Coalition for inviting me again. I love doing these. So thank you for inviting me again and organizing this. Thank all of you for being here. I believe there's almost 40 of you here, so that's really great. And it's always rewarding for me to be able to participate with you in these conversations. I learned so much from them, and actually they shape a lot of the questions that I ask as a researcher, because that's primarily kind of what I do. Is I do research on these issues and collect data about them and things like that. So that's part of my work role. So the things that I learn in these workshops, they show up in talks that I do everywhere. And I really learn a lot from you guys. I believe this is the 4th or the 5th workshop that I've done under this title, Talking to Children About Race, over the past couple of years. And this time it is in a social context that seems way more urgent and somewhat different than all of the other contexts. So let me just get started. My overarching goals are to address these questions. How do children learn the meaning of race? That is, how do they learn what it means to be Black or white or Dominican, which is an ethnicity, or Japanese or anything else? How do adults and things that happen in classrooms and lunchrooms and street corners and department stores teach children about the meaning of race? And most importantly, what kind of messages to them about who they are as racial beings are most helpful? So here's where I'm going to ask. I just want to know kind of who's in the room. And that's the first thing I'm going to do. And then after that, I want to set the stage by providing a little bit of background context about, the context in which we're teaching race to children, what we know about what we call ethnic and racial socialization. And then I'll get into some strategies about talking about race to kids. Okay, so these are the polls that you're going to answer. Number 1, what is your role versus vis-a-vis children? So that's the first one. If people could just fill that out.
See, so go to the bottom of your screen.
And these answers are coming in. We've gotten about 27 of 33, so we'll just give it another minute before we close this poll.
Okay, cool. So
and then I'll be able to share the results.
Yeah, mostly parents, right? Is that right? Is that what I see? Mostly parents, some teachers, about 30%, some grandparents. Okay, I'm interested in the age of the children that you are thinking about when you want to learn this. Cool.
Right.
Okay, great. Ethnic racial background of participants here? Okay. And then the last question is, have you ever had a conversation with a young person about race? Okay, cool.
And Diane, we have about 90% of folks responding at this point.
That's fine. That's great. That's good. All right, let's go ahead and move on. And whoever is, if I forget to say next slide, just let me know, because I'm looking at my own slides and you guys are looking at them on the screen, and I forget that the screens are different. So we should be going to slide number 5 right now.
Okay.
Okay. And if I forget, slide number 5 says, yeah, concept of ethnicity and race. So before I go too far, right, I realize that I've been using the term race to refer to dynamics that can stem from either race or ethnicity. And obviously, as you all know, probably these terms are not the same. And so when I say race or racial, I'm going to ask that you actually hear the more appropriate but cumbersome term race, ethnicity, or racial ethnic, because that's what I mean. Of course, race has no biological basis. We construct it socially. It's typically based on phenotypic characteristics, and mostly a term that has been used historically to refer to Blacks and whites. Ethnicity has more to do with culture, shared history, traditions, heritage, and language, and it's used more often in referring to Latinos and Asians and immigrant whites. Okay, next slide. So why is talking about race to children actually important and something that we should care about? Next slide, 7. The first reason, there are a couple of reasons. The first reason is that children are learning race anyway, regardless of whether you're talking to them about it. They're learning it anyway. Next slide. As infants and young children, children are noticing and attending to race, and researchers know this through eye tracking studies that have shown that infants notice and pay attention to race by the time they're 3 to 6 months of age. This picture right here is of a Newsweek article that made the cover about a decade ago, actually. Next slide, number 9. By the time kids are 3 to 5, children are using race as a basis for including and excluding other children. In a great book called The First R, Fagan and Osdale observed preschoolers using a lot of language in the playground and in school, including racial epithets. Things like, you can't play because you're Chinese, they heard, or I won't nap next to you, you have brown skin and it's dirty. I'm going to assume that most of you have heard of the classic doll studies. If not, you can ask me about them later. But the results of these studies have been replicated over and over again and show that kids primarily prefer same race kids. So white kids clearly prefer same race kids, and Black kids and Latino kids early on show an other race preference for the dominant group and later change that. Slide 10. Kids, by the time they're in kindergarten, they're very clearly showing what we call in-group preference. That is a preference for people of their own ethnic group. And indeed, they show racial bias. And researchers have recently documented what we call implicit racial bias. Implicit meaning bias attitudes where you would have no control over they're not conscious. You're not consciously aware of them. And they've shown those biased attitudes in kids as young as 6 years old. Next slide, please. By the time kids are 10, they understand sophisticated things. They understand that people can hold and act upon racial stereotypes. They attribute certain situations to structural racism. So that's a very complex thing that kids, obviously 3 to 5 years old, don't understand those things, but by the time kids are 10, they do. For example, they name discrimination as a reason why it might be hard for a Black person to be elected president. And these are relatively old studies where we thought we would never, ever, ever see a Black president. So it'd be really, really interesting to see what's coming up now if people use the same methods. And kids also report their own experiences with discrimination by the time they're 10, which is something I'll return to. So overall, the first important reason to talk to children about race is that they're naturally learning it anyway. Slide 12 is where I am if I forgot. Are you with me? Can you just say yes or no? Are you at
Sorry, yes, I'm muted, we're good.
Great, all right, slide 13. All right, so a second reason why talking to children about race is important is because children are growing up amidst vast racial disparities and in segregated settings, and therefore it becomes evident to children that, you know, the differences, the physical distinctiveness of people of different races it becomes evident to them that that's associated with certain things, right? And that it has meaning and that they should actually pay attention to them. And this noticing of difference almost naturally what breeds what we call in-group bias or a preference for others who look like them, which I've mentioned already. And if we're not talking to kids about race, they're coming to their own conclusions about what these things mean. Next slide. So we have these regularities in our social system, and we have racial disparities between Blacks and whites, and sometimes they mostly favor whites, and sometimes, although not always, they favor Asians over Black and Latinos and Native Americans. So here's just a list of a few things where areas where racial disparities exist. So American children are growing up in the midst of these disparities. They notice them, they observe them, yet the dominant narrative in our country is that diversity is appreciated and valued, and that discrimination actually ended when Rosa Parks sat on the bus. Next slide, please. So here's a little thing I'm going to ask you to do. So by regularity, what I mean is the fact that something exists or happens repeatedly in a fixed pattern. So those disparities across a range of, next slide, please, across this range is something that is fixed, right? And as I said, this is only a partial list. And as we all know, the disparities that have been and will continue to be promoted by COVID in infection rates, mortality, and disease really brought the reality of these disparities to the public's attention. Next slide, please, 17. So here's a question. Please write your answer in chat, and then we'll talk about them later. What is your best guess about the kinds of conclusions children draw when they're observing these disparities in various places they go and in the media, but no one's talking to them about how or why they exist? I'm going to give you about 60 seconds just to give that some thought, and then we'll talk about it later. Okay, great. Thank you for your answers. I was keeping track of some of them, and basically they're right on target. Like if nobody's talking about them, they make assumptions that are actually not correct about why these disparities actually exist. All right, now I need to get back to my own screen. Okay, so let's see. I'm sorry. A second, we are on slide 18 now, okay? Kids are also growing up in an area that's all very, very segregated. So what they're learning basically is that certain spaces are for certain races. Kids are learning that everywhere, right? So we see segregation. I'm just going to run through this. 80% of churches are mostly the same race. And when you see little notations in parentheses, that's the citation, the place where this research came from. So 80% of churches are mostly same race. Most family networks have same race friends. Neighborhoods are incredibly segregated, more so than they were in the 1960s. Because of that, schools are segregated, more segregated than they were in 1954. And even within schools, right, within diverse schools, there's segregation in classrooms, lunch tables, extracurricular activities, and things like that. Slide 24, please. And then the issue of race is also all over the media, especially now. And I mention the media explicitly because so many parents and kids who we've interviewed about, we ask them, like, how does race come up in your family? When your family, when it comes up, how, what are you talking about? How does it come up? And so many of them mention that they've seen something on the news or that something happened in the media. So I mention it explicitly because parents and kids generally view the news and the media as a source of places that kids learn about race. Next slide, please. And then the final reason, right? So children are learning race anyway. They're growing up amidst these vast racial disparities, and they're experiencing things that are related to race that are stressful for them. So this is just a survey. This is data that comes from a large survey of a probability sample of 15 to 24-year-olds, which means it's a random sample. And it was conducted by Georgetown University in collaboration with MTV, and youth were asked whether or not they had witnessed or experienced discrimination within the past 12 months. And what you see with these data is that most youth, including almost half of white youth, are at least exposed to discrimination. And so the large majority of them are exposed to discrimination, and about a quarter to a third of youth are experiencing discrimination, and that is within the past 12 months. And they experience it quite young, actually. So this is 15-year-olds, but in our data, kids are reporting discrimination when they're 10. We ask their parents, have you talked to your child about race and discrimination? No, they're too young to understand that. And then we talk to the kid and they're telling us all the ways in which they see it. Next slide, please, 27. So, like I said, talking to children about race is critical because children are learning it, they're living in racialized context, and they're experiencing and witnessing discrimination, which is actually very harmful for them. So one of the reasons why workshops like this are so important is that despite all the learning about race that children are doing and everything that they're seeing, the dominant cultural narrative we have had in this country, literally until this past spring, is that we, and especially children, do not see race, that we're all equal regardless of the color of our skin. And I think it's sometimes easy to underestimate the imaging that children are exposed to, but signs in public spaces and on billboards look very much like these signs. So what strategies are there for talking to children about race, something that parents typically don't do? I was tempted to show you some of my data, but it would have taken too long. But mostly the burden of talking about race is on families of color. Very few white parents, actually, even in studies that have been done following things like the shooting of Trayvon Martin, studies find that white parents basically just don't talk to their kids about race, right? They want their kids to continue to feel comfortable. They don't want to scare them. They don't want to put bad ideas in their head. And in my view, that's a big mistake because basically the burden of talking about racial issues in this country falls on parents of color. So I'm going to just introduce you to this concept, which is what I do my research on, which is the concept of racial socialization. And basically, it's defined as parental behaviors, practices, and beliefs, right? So that's a wide range of things that communicate information, worldviews about race and ethnicity to children, right? And so it's a very broad definition. Number one, and that has a lot of advantages because number one, it doesn't assume that anything that we're teaching kids is intentional. My position is that we need to be intentional, right? Because we're doing it anyway, even if it's not intentional. When you're locking your doors, when you're going through Newark, you are teaching your kids about race. So kids are picking up on all this these subtle cues. And so being intentional about it is really important. It's also applicable to all parents. All parents are teaching race, even if they're not mentioning race at all. They're teaching something about it just by the fact that they're not mentioning it. And then it encompasses many possible things that parents might do, right? And one of the points that I try to make in all of these talks is that there is no, people talk about the talk in Black families in particular, right? What is the talk? There's no one talk, right? There are a lot of talks. And talking about race to kids has to become comfortable, like talking about, oh, who's your best friend in school, right? And right now it's uncomfortable, like talking about sex with kids or talking about drugs with teenagers, right? Those are uncomfortable, and race is uncomfortable. And we need to get to a place in our country where it is comfortable, where it's not so taboo. So it encompasses many things that parents might do, taking kids places, exposing them to different people, you know, like all the things that parents do that teach race. Okay, in my work, I've distinguished these different kinds of messages, right? So there are lots of different kinds of messages that parents can send. One I call egalitarianism, and those are messages, and these are not mutually exclusive, right? Parents can send all of these messages at the same time. So one is egalitarianism, which are messages regarding appreciating all groups and the importance of diversity. And most parents of all races, this is, we ask them what they do, or we ask them to complete surveys, this is the most likely thing they say, right? Everybody has the same blood, nobody's got blue blood, you know, we're all the same, deep down we're the same, that's what I teach my kids. That's the first response. There's cultural socialization, which is messages regarding the cultural practices of your own group and their history and heritage and pride. And parents of color are much more likely to do this than others. And I can give you some stuff that I've written about this because parents have different goals in doing this. Then there's something that we call preparation for racial bias, or PrEP for bias for short. And these are messages to kids regarding prejudice and discrimination, and in particular, how to cope with it. It won't surprise you that parents of color, and especially African-American parents, are way more likely to do this than Asian parents or Hispanic parents or white parents. They're just way more likely to, because we've always had to do this, right? We've always had to. We've been in this context that's extremely racialized and where oppression is rampant of Black population. So this is something that's way more comfortable, I think, for Black families to do. And then there's something we call promotion of mistrust, which is supposed to be theoretically different from talking about discrimination, but parents kind of worry that if they talk about discrimination, they're also going to promote mistrust. But we see it as something different, right? That mistrust is warnings or cautions about other groups or about cross-group interactions. Okay, so that's kind of like the content that we talk about, but here are some key characteristics. First of all, racial socialization can be proactive or it can be reactive, right? So by proactive, that's racial socialization where there's specific goals and ways to attain them. And sorry, I'm looking for something that I need. That could include exposing kids to diversity. It can include history and experiences of many groups. It can include noting inequity, inequality, stereotyping, and discrimination when you see it. And then what I call an approach mentality, like approaching the issue of race and not avoiding it. Slide 35, please. I'm sorry, I think you may be way behind me. I got a little bit caught up and forgot.
I'm with you.
You are? Okay, cool. Then there's reactive racial socialization, right? And so this is racial socialization, which is basically discussions about race that come up when you didn't expect it, right? They're often child initiated. Lots of times parents are caught off guard. Lots of times with this kind of socialization, parents are at a loss as to what to say. And I think this is the kind of socialization that parents worry about the most. And, this is kind of going to happen because kids are curious. I'm just going to read you a quote from one of the really early focus groups I did, where a parent is talking about this kind of socialization. The parent says, "About 3 years ago, I was sitting downstairs watching television, and on Showtime, they had a little bit of Denzel Washington in Roots. My son was sitting there next to me. I guess he was 2.5, maybe 3. And there's a scene where they're coming in and destroying the Bantustan. And there's one vivid shot where there's a little Black boy running, trying to get away from the police, and the police just leaned out and shot this little boy. And it really kind of happened before I could think. And my son said, 'Daddy, why did he shoot the little boy? And how do you explain to a 2.5-year-old that the little boy was shot because he was Black?' And he kept saying, 'Daddy, why? Why are they doing that to them?' And trying to explain this whole concept is so difficult. and they continue to ask, why, how come? And it's such a devilish, terrible situation that you really can't explain it, but you have to try. Right. So that's kind of what happens when in a lot of situations, that's how race comes up. And for those of you with young kids, and there are a fair number of you that have young kids, there's so many things that are happening that your child could encounter, even if you try to protect them. Right. There's George Floyd, there's the protests, there are all the Black Lives Matter signs around, especially in South Orange. There are also positive things like, our Joe Biden's pick for vice president and things like that. So there are a lot of things that your child might encounter, even if you're trying to protect them, that you need to be ready to discuss with them. So that's a really important characteristic. And my bias is always to be proactive, always to have in mind, what are the goals? What do I want my child to learn? And I know that people want answers, and hopefully we'll get to, discussing some possible scenarios and answers. But I think my main answer is I can't give you words, because I can't anticipate, like, is your child going to say, oh, why is the car burning, Dad? What are they doing? But the thing is, the parents worry so much about whether they're giving the right answer that they don't give any answer. And what I want to say is, you have to keep trying. And the more you try, the more, there's no single instance in which an answer you give is going to damage your child for life. Like, even if they're 3 to 5, they're going to grow up. They're going to be 11 to 14, and they're going to understand the complexities of race in our country, and they're going to learn about the history of it. So there's no one situation that's going to damage your child or make your child prejudiced. What you don't want to communicate is, this is uncomfortable and we don't need to talk about this. Okay, so I'm on slide 38, sorry. Your child's age obviously matters, and that's one of the things that we tried to point out in our article. So obviously 0 to 2-year-olds have a limited capacity to understand things, but with everything that kids are on these days, it's not impossible that a 2-year-old could come, like the 2.5-year-old who saw the part of Roots, could come with questions. And with a 0 to 2-year-old, they have limited capacity to understand. And so you want to keep your answers as brief and as short as possible. So if your child says, why are they burning, the car? And it's just, you can say it's very complicated, but people are angry about how people aren't always treated well, and people are angry at that. 3 to 5-year-olds, have more of a capacity, but still limited capacity to understand things. And so lots of proactive exposure to diversity, right, is a good thing. Exposure through what you have in your home, toys, books, magazines, art, exposure through who you have in your home, right, who your friends are, challenging negative stereotypes that they see, protecting them as much as possible from negative current events. So you don't want your 3 to 5-year-old seeing a police officer kneeling on someone's neck. If you can help it, if they do see it, you need to be prepared to say, sometimes people do bad things. If asked, simple answers, concrete answers, honest answers, though, right? Honest answers. And it's fine to say, I was hoping you wouldn't see that. Right, I was hoping you wouldn't see that. 6 to 10, so you'll notice that all through here, I have lots of proactive exposure to diversity, lots of challenging negative messages. So that's relevant for any age. 6 to 10, lots of proactive exposure, challenging negative messages. Also including questions about what the child knows, right? Because lots of kids who experience discrimination, according to studies that have asked about this, actually don't report it to their parents, right? They don't, because they think that, their parents are going to get mad, their parents are going to do something like go up to the school, they don't want them to do that, so they just don't tell them, right? So questions about what the child knows about race and what the child understands about race and are fine to ask 6 to 10-year-old. And then in terms of things they might see, more honest answers. And then by the time kids are 11 to 14, they have the capacity to understand very complex things. So lots of proactive exposure to diversity, of course, questions about a child's own experiences of race, and question about a child's opinions about what's happening, and race relations and things like that. I didn't even include slide 15 to 18-year-old because they, they're starting to think much like adults. So you can have very adult-like conversations with kids over 15. Okay, so how do you get there? Number one, you educate yourself about yourself. And what does that mean? We all have implicit biases, so accepting those and figuring out what they are, studying your own social network, looking at who your friends are, who do you associate with, studying the places you go, looking at your home for things that suggest that you value diversity, because kids pick up on that, paying attention to how you feel when you see injustice or unfairness in the person or in the media, and having conversations with other adults in your home about what you want your children to know, think, and believe about racial and ethnic group differences and commonalities. And, people don't always see this the same. Grandmother sees it different than mom. Mom sees it different than dad. Kids see it different than parents. We have a lot of that. And then make a plan. So, educate yourself about yourself, actively challenge stereotypes that your child is exposed to. Actively, it's like, do you think that's true? They see these on the street, in news, in ads, and books. They're all over the place. Acknowledging differences where they may exist, and actively looking for positive narratives and examples of people from marginalized groups to share with your kids. Talk with your child about fairness, unfairness, equity, and justice. Encourage conversations about race and difference. And here, answer rather than avoid your child's questions about race. Ask about and try to reframe negative comments that your child might make. Bring diversity into your household and into your life, right? Through your friendships, through the places you go, through the things that you do. Toys, books, games, people, taking your child to places with diversity, and working towards introducing diversity into your network by doing things that expose you to diverse people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. That was Dr. Hughes, I'm sorry.
You can call me Diane, it's fine.
I always at this point, we are going to open it to, this is where we really all should be clapping and cheering, but since we can't really do that unless you want to do what I really don't like, which are the little emoticon things, but this is your opportunity to ask questions. Now, again, I remind you that you may very well not get your question answered. Please use the chat. We are going to collect the chat questions, and if we don't look at them tonight, we will be posting answers on the Coalition website. I would appreciate it if you would actually raise your hand close to your face where it can be seen, and I'm going to call on people, at least see how well we can do this, and Diane is going to answer. So when you get called on, you'll of course unmute and ask your question. So who would like to start with the questions? And of course, the people who don't have their cameras on are going to be a little bit excluded at this point. So I'm looking for a question. Alice Robinson Gilman, unmute yourself, Alice.
Okay. Should I start?
Start.
Okay. In some ways, I find what you spoke about and how to speak with your child in many ways very similar to how one responds when they ask you about sexuality at any age. And I can't remember the second thing, but and I think that requires honesty, assessment of where the child is at, but being honest and telling them what the information that they're interested in. So I found that as a commonality, and I just remembered the other thing, speaking with girls about what they might encounter in the workplace and in school as far as sexual people taking advantage of them or, doing something sexual to them. So I just thought that was running through my mind the whole time, the similarity.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So yes, thank you for pointing that out. I agree that, there are certain things in our culture for whatever reason. I mean, adults have sex, right? And they desire sex, but we don't ever talk about it, right? We don't ever talk, even when we're talking about sex, we don't talk about desire. And it's just one of those things that like, you just want to pretend like it doesn't exist. And it's so taboo in our culture. In really, really interesting ways, and and race is the same is the same way, right? It's among the white families, especially the the quote unquote dominant group. It's just something that you don't talk about, and sometimes it just stuns me. We'll have a conversation with a colleague of mine who's very liberal and sort of, does work with, ethnic minority youth and, stuff like that, assuming, oh, you must have been socialized to care about these things. Like, no, we never talked about race in my family. It was impolite. No, it would never come up. It just would not come up.
Okay, thank you. And when you're finished, if you would mute yourself back because there are too many people. We had a question come in via chat from Tamara Windell-Melmer, who asked us, who says, Dr. Hughes, I would be interested in hearing from you about whether, I think this is by people of color youth, feel they have the tools to be able to identify when they are being discriminated against, especially when growing up in the society we live in. Thanks. Did you get that, Diane?
No, can you repeat that?
Yeah, I would be interested in hearing from you about whether by people of color youth, feel they have the tools to be able to identify when they're being discriminated against, especially in this society. I mean, I think it's it's a question to respond to by.
Black Indigenous.
Yes, BIPOC.
Okay, BIPOC. Okay, Black Indigenous. Okay, got it. I was like, what do you mean bisexual? Like biracial? Like what?
Well, wait, I actually didn't recognize it. What is it?
So do they feel they have the tools? I don't know that they feel that they have the tools to cope with it, but they have the tools to recognize it, right? So they we've been working on some papers recently where we have looked at the stories that youth are telling about their experiences with discrimination. And these stories start, so, these are 11-year-olds that we're talking to, and they have very, New York City 11-year-olds, they may be different than South Orange 11-year-olds, but, my kids came home and say, the cops thought we were from, Newark, and they didn't believe us when we said, I'm going to my house, which is right around the corner, right? And so they definitely recognize it. Whether they have, having the tools to deal with it, that's a whole nother arena, because kids of color believe that they're not affected by it, but studies actually show disruption in sleep patterns, disruption in, cortisol fluctuation during the day, things like that. Even when kids are saying, oh, I was angry, but I let it go, it wasn't a big deal, they really are affected by it.
Dr. Hughes, thank you so much. This is Tamara. I'm sorry my camera is not working. That was my question that I put into the chat. I really appreciate your response. I think I was just noticing some of the variance in the chart that you shared across different ethnicities of those young people who, identify discriminatory acts or who have experienced themselves or viewed them. And that's what prompted my question. And potentially, and your response made a lot of sense. I'm just also curious about like the normalization of all of these things in the society that we live in, if you feel that that has any effect on the studies that you were sharing around those results that you shared in your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I quite, I'm not sure that I quite have a handle on what you're asking, but let me feed it back to you, and then you can sort of steer me in a better direction. So what I hear you asking is whether, you know, the fact that it's so become so expected because those numbers are so high, right, of kids of color in particular reporting that they experience discrimination or that they see it, right? So about a third of them reporting that they experienced it within the past 12 months. And about, you know, 70 to 80% of them saying that they've seen it, that they've witnessed it. So is it consequential for them for it to become so expected, so regular, right? Just part of what they have to deal with. Is that what you're asking me?
Yes, that's exactly right. Thank you.
Okay. So the best way I know is that there are a lot of both experimental, there's tons of research on discrimination and its consequences for youth, tons of it. And there's a very, very consistent finding, which is that it has negative consequences for youth. That's no surprise. What's surprising is that it's across all domains. So one might say, you know, oh, it's going to affect their self-esteem. It's going to affect their identity, their racial identity. It's going to affect, you know, some specific area, but it's every area, right? So I wish I had my slide handy, but it affects, you know, the engagement in delinquent behavior. It affects school performance. It affects engagement in school. It affects psychosomatic symptomatology. It affects school attendance. It affects stress. It affects cortisol patterns. It affects sleep patterns. Some of these studies are longitudinal, meaning they follow kids over time. And so they're in a better position to, you know, make causal sort of things. They also have studies that show, like if you look within individuals, you can demonstrate that on days when kids experience discrimination, right? More discrimination than their average level of discrimination. So on days when people experience more discrimination, they also report less sleep the next day, or more stress the next day, or more conflictual relationships the next day. So that's within people, right? Within a single person. Also studies that show, like there's one study that I think is some of the best evidence that we have, which is there was a woman who followed a bunch of middle school kids in Prince George's County, and she collected information about their discrimination experiences every year for 4 years, right, when they were adolescents. Then another researcher got funded to follow these people up when they were adults and to actually study the cortisol patterns. And when they looked at disrupted cortisol patterns among Black adults who were in this study, and there were a couple hundred of them, they found that the accumulation of experiences of discrimination during adolescence was what was most highly linked to their cortisol patterns when they were young adults, like 24 years old, right? So what they had reported when they were adolescents is associated with their cortisol pattern as adults. And so now we're starting to think that, you know, adolescence is such a sensitive period for so many things, and there's so many biological and changes in your brain that happen during adolescence, that that's a very destructive period for kids to be experiencing so much discrimination.
Thank you, Diane. I'd like to have us, we have time for a couple more questions, 2 or 3, before we have Diane's wrap up. So I'm looking for hands that are high enough that I can see. Who else would like to have a question or comment?
Can somebody throw out a scenario that they've had that we can talk about?
I'm sorry, who was that, please?
It was me.
Oh, it's you, Diane. I'm sorry. That's a great idea. We're looking for a scenario.
Like some situation where you felt like, oh, okay, what should I do? Or something you fear, something that hasn't happened, but you're thinking about it.
Well, I have a really tiny one. This which while people are thinking, this is my 4-year-old granddaughter. Her family made a Black Lives Matter sign, and they put it in the window, and everybody's white in their neighborhood, and they're white. And after a while, she says, 4 years old, "Why don't all lives matter?"
Right. Yeah.
But what's the answer to that one?
Hearing that. What did your, let me ask what the answer was.
I'm not sure what they, I wasn't there. I know what my answer is. It would be something about a family and how you love everybody, but when someone comes to you and their fingers hurt, you don't say, "I love mommy and daddy and George and Frankie, and I also love you." You say, "I love you." I mean, in other words, you go to the person who has a need or at that time. But
I'm curious what other people think.
so I'm sorry, what did you say?
I'm curious what other people, like, what would other people do?
What would other people do to the 4-year-old who says, "Don't all lives matter"? What about that? Judy and Steve. I'm going by, and then after Judy and Steve, Naomi Kirkman, I see.
Oh, here we go.
But Judy, you go first.
Yeah, I just want to respond to your response to a 4-year-old on that. We have a 3.5-year-old, so similar, and we've been having a lot of conversations just recently because our daughter is actually Black and adopted. So she's had a lot of questions similar to that, and our response, we've thought about it beforehand. We were not surprised by the questions, but our response has been really just more factual for her. Whereas we feel like it's important to have the opportunity to say to her, like, in our society, in the world that we live in, Black people are often treated more unfairly than white people are. And I don't even know if that was the right approach to like separate her like that, and especially with our transracial family structure. I don't know, maybe that's not age appropriate, but we kind of felt like we needed her to already have an understanding that her race does impact the way that people see her.
Thank you. How about Naomi? And then we'll go back to Diane.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I was just thinking that there was a poster that I saw, one of the images circulating when the protests were happening back in June was of a little girl who held up a poster and she said, "Of course all lives matter. It's just that Black lives are hurting right now." So that's probably a way that I would respond to a young child who asks about that. Of course all lives do matter, and you're right that all lives do matter, but right now Black lives need our help and Black lives matter. That's why people are saying that Black lives matter. It doesn't mean that other lives don't matter.
Thank you. Diane?
Well, I think you had more people on your list.
Anybody else? You want more responses, Diane?
One more, maybe?
One more response? How about from somebody who's not white? Okay, Yolanda, thank you. You beat me to it. You need to unmute yourself.
I gotcha. So Judy and Steve, I have 3 boys. Much older, 23, 18, or soon to be 19 and 20. And with your daughter, it started at a very early age in having those conversations. So it made them more aware of the world that they were operating in. So it wouldn't come as a surprise. Now, when it does happen, it is because they were raised and taught everyone's equal. We don't see race, even though they do in the environment. We treat everyone the same. But when it does happen, it doesn't come, it's shocking, but they have a premise, right? There's a foundation, there's a discussion that's happened in the home. So I don't think it can happen early enough, because that's how we're able to guide and steer children to be accepting, to be open, to understand all lives matter. But in this society, or what Blacks are experiencing now, is pain and hurt and history behind it.
Right.
So if there are facts that are built into that, then there's a holistic awareness, I think, that's needed, because it makes them more aware as they're walking through the world.
Thank you.
Right, that's right.
Diane, why don't you finish this one up and then we'll do one more question.
Yeah, that's what I would say. I mean, I would say that in the same way that knowing that history has been, it's just a key, like Black kids and other kids too, kids of other races too. We found this also Asian kids who are immigrants to the US, or Hispanic kids, some of whom are immigrants, some of who are from Puerto Rico, which is whatever, but who are very grounded in their knowledge about their culture and knowledge about their history. What they say is not, gosh, I'm less than, right? They say, I come from a strong ass group of people. And I'm so proud of the people who've fought for us and the people and I'm standing where I am on the shoulders of a lot of people who did a lot of work, right? And so there's not a fear of, if I tell them about slavery, if I tell them about Jim Crow, if I tell them Reconstruction failed, that they're going to feel bad, right? They get a sense of strength from that. And so the question is, do white kids also, or any kids does knowledge about the true racial history of our country? So Germany is a country that has accepted its past. They have a horrid past. They've accepted their past, and the fact that we have not accepted our past becomes an issue for everyone, right? It becomes an issue for everyone. And so talking about discrimination and the history of it and the remnants of it, I think is okay. That's the only way we're going to get past where we are today, because otherwise kids think, oh, there's something wrong with, there's something wrong with them because, like we have to say their lives matter. Like, what's wrong with them? Why do we have to say that? And obviously you don't want that, but you need a conversation, right? You need a conversation about it. So.
Thank you very much, Diane. Time for one more question. Remember, you can also write them in the chat. So how about one more hand raised high with a question? I'm looking for a hand. Sally Solo, okay? You get the last one. Okay, good.
Hi. Two things. One, we went to the same high school. I just have to say that. In my class. So I recognized your name when I saw that you were speaking, and I'm so glad to.
I recognize your name too.
Okay.
Pretty distinctive. Okay.
My kids are a lot older, but I do teach in a school, and you said about a third of the people in the chat are teachers. So
yeah.
I guess now I started to think now, teaching about racism, teaching about sex education, how controversial sex education was.
Oh yeah.
Sometimes is. What do you think about having these conversations between teachers and in school? And I also wonder, are parents comfortable with that?
Well, so, I mean, there's a very huge no, parents are not comfortable with sex education. That's the main barrier to implementing a real sex education class, right, course for students. And until recently, it was still abstinence, basically. I'm like, how realistic is this? And so, so there are a lot, when we're talking about the history of race in our country, the question is how much, if you did that in a real way, outside of the African-American history or African-American literature class, how much pushback would there be? These are parents who want their kids to be competitive. They want their kids learning AP statistics and, calculus, advanced calculus, that, why are you spending time in my class, in school, teaching them about this stuff? And the question I have really is, I think it remains to be seen what kind of consciousness raising really just happened. Because we've seen an awareness of race and awareness of inequality in ways that we have never seen it before, coming from the top down, CEOs of companies, Amazon pledging, I don't know, like $10 million to racial justice work in cities. I mean, we're seeing this kind of acknowledgement of oppression, the history of oppression and structural racism, even being called a public health crisis, like in Minneapolis and other cities, we're seeing acknowledgement of it in a way that we have never, ever, ever seen it before. And so the question is, will there be, how much pushback would there be if we actually taught this in schools? You know, I don't know. It remains to kind of be seen. I think it would be great, because what kids learn in school about, even during Black History Month, is so superficial. And once they get, I can remember being at a performance by a very interracial group of kids, something you would see at GFS, right? A very interracial group of kids in New York City performing the March on Selma across the, and they had to study it, and they were playing different roles, and they were saying, God, I had no idea that high school students were so active. Like they felt so empowered that as high school students, they could be so, such movers and shakers in a movement like the civil rights movement. They had no idea. Their understanding of the civil rights movement was that Rosa Parks decided one day that she was going to sit on the bus, and that changed everything for Blacks. And that's what they knew. You know, that's what they knew. So we do not teach it in any real way. It's as if it's not a part of our history. So.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes. We're going to let you do the wrap up. There was, however, one question that came in on chat that you may want to include in the wrap up, which is going back to your comment about Germany. Why do you think they have been able to learn from their past and take ownership, but we have not? What do they do in Germany to take ownership that we didn't? And if you don't want to answer it, it's fine, but we would like your closing wrap up. And at that point, Nancy Gagne, the executive director, will take over.
I don't really know the answer to that question. What have they done? They have things like, you know, we have like all the monuments that have been taken down, the Confederate flag and things like that, that have been up for so long. They have, you know, they over in Germany, they have, you know, tributes to sort of Jews and you know, they don't have like the plantations. I can remember taking my kid to a plantation when we were college visiting. He was my oldest of 4, and all his friends had gone, and they were like, oh, you should see these plantations and mansions are blah, blah, blah. And I said to him when we were there, I said, your ancestors, they're ghosts hanging from these trees for you, right? And your friends are not talking about that. It's just so skirted over. I think because we want to deny our history. I don't really have a good explanation of why Germany had a bit better approach, but we've historically wanted to deny our privilege, because maybe if we acknowledge our privilege, we have to give some of it up.
And Debbie Whistle, for those of you who can look at your chat, suggests that there's a big difference in that the leadership of Germany lost.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
So
yeah.
Diane, wrap up in whatever way you want.
I'm not quite sure how to wrap up. Thank all of you. I love hearing your opinions and your experiences. And I think the biggest message that the bottom line message is twofold. Number one is, you know, be intentional and think about what you want your kids to learn, and make your actions consistent with your goals, right? Proactively, be intentional about it. Don't be afraid of it. And then the second thing that I would say is, don't be afraid of making mistakes, because you will. You'll say the wrong thing at some point in time. And the more comfortable you get and the more you do it, the better you are at it. And nothing that you do in any one instance is going to ruin your child for life. So those are my closing comments.
Nancy Gagne.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hughes, once again for sharing your insights, and thank you to everybody who showed up. I want to thank the co-chairs of the Schools Committee, Carol Barry Austin and Meredith Sue Willis, our program director, Audrey Rowe, who has my name right now because we're co-hosts on Zoom, and Tegan Culler, who has been so helpful to us in all of our Zoom efforts. She's one of our trustees. Speaking of being intentional, I'm going to pick up from Diane's comment about being intentional. There are so many ways that you can be intentional about racial integration and racial equity issues in our community through the work of the Community Coalition on Race. As I said at the beginning, we work in so many areas of community life. Coming up this fall for the schools committee, voting is intentional, and we want you to know about the Board of Education candidates, especially since our school system, as all school systems are, struggling to deal with changes in the delivery of education. So look for that candidates forum coming up in early fall. Speaking of our history and the pressures of white supremacy and white nationalism that continue to influence and wreak havoc with many of our attempts to change things, we have Jelani Cobb coming for Conversations on Race. That is October 20th, I want to say, but check our website, communitycoalitiononrace.org. And I also want to say that we do things to raise money too to carry on this work. And our annual dinner, which we usually hold at the Woodland, this year will be virtual. Details will be coming out in the next few weeks. And our honoree is Meredith Sue Willis, who led us tonight. So we hope that you will come out for that big event in the fall. That is Saturday, October 17th. Virtual. It's going to be a lot of fun, even though we're going to be in a space like this. We have a lot in store for you. So thank you to all of you, and have a good night.